Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. In 1964, archaeologists from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation conducted excavations in a large grassy field on the outskirts of Williamsburg's historic core known as Custis Square. In the early 1700s, this plot of land was the location of a manor house built and inhabited by John Custis IV, known to history as one of Virginia's most avid gardeners and Martha Washington's first father-in-law. Reading through the monthly reports written by Noel Hume, the director of the Department of Archaeology at the time, it is clear that he was expecting to find great things at the site. For years prior to the excavation, Hume brought up the possibility that Custis Square contained artifacts which could be directly related to Custis's garden and/or Martha Washington. However, while the archaeologists quickly located Custis's 1718 manor house, its foundations were mostly robbed, and its cellar was filled with debris from the early 19th century, when it was demolished. As the summer stretched into fall, the tone of Hume's monthly reports became more disappointed as feature after feature was found to be filled with either late 18th or early 19th century artifacts, all significantly post-dating Custis IV's death in 1749. That all changed in October when Hume's excavators reached the bottom of a 40-foot deep well, denoted Well B, and found a remarkable set of artifacts waiting for them. Characterized by Hume as, quote, the most important single closely dated assemblage of cultural material known to have come from any Williamsburg excavation, unquote. This assemblage contained over 7,000 cataloged artifacts, including 18 clear-stemmed drinking glasses, boxwood and holly clippings, about 60 wine bottles with the John Custis seal, and 5 tin-glazed tea bowls, which are the subject of my colleague Victoria Gumm's presentation that you should go watch after this. While the majority of the fill layers found in Well B contained artifacts that were not manufactured until the late 18th century, Noel Hume argued that the artifacts found in the lowest layer of the well were actually deposited several decades earlier, when the household furnishings of the manor house were being cleared out following Custis's death. According to Hume's interpretations of events, the well was then left open, with water covering the trash deposit at its base, and used for many years until it was ultimately filled sometime around the American Revolution. As part of Colonial Williamsburg's current excavations focused on the Custis Square Gardens, I decided to re-examine and recontextualize the assemblage at the base of Well B in order to verify Hume's interpretation of its depositional history, as well as fit into our current understanding of household clearance deposits. Well B was lined with brick and excavated 40 feet and 1 inch into the subsoil beneath Custis Square. The base of the well cut into the Yorktown Formation, a layer of unconsolidated sand and clay filled with fossil bivalves deposited during the late Miocene and early Pliocene. There is good reason to believe that the well was constructed sometime in 1737, as Custis sent some fossils along with a letter to Peter Collinson that year, which he said he, quote, took out of the bottom of a well 40 feet deep, end quote. Excavators ultimately divided the well fill into 21 layers, designated B through Y, which fell into 3 basic groupings. The uppermost group, consisting of layers B through M, were thin lenses filled with ash and charred wood. These layers seem to represent hearth ash sweepings that were dumped into the depression made by the well as it settled in the months and years after it was filled. The next group, consisting of layers N through T, were thick deposits of mostly sterile silty clay. These layers represent the soil which was dumped into the well when it was filled. The final group consisted of organic sludge filled with artifacts and botanical remains. These layers are the ones which contain the majority of the artifacts that were recovered from the well, including all of the wine bottles and plant clippings. Hume noted that there were some indications that the upper 2 layers of the organic sludge were deposited when the well was filled, while the lower 2 layers were deposited earlier. Layers V and W contained bricks from the wellhead and a wooden bucket, which was fully intact when found and was interpreted as the well bucket. The lowest layers, X and Y, were the ones with the wine bottles and with Custis seals, and therefore the ones most likely to have been deposited while the well was still open. I used 3 methods to test the interpretation that some or all of the organic sludge layers were deposited while the well was still in use. First, I calculated the mean ceramic date, TPQ, and TPQ 95 of the ceramic sherds recovered from each layer of the well. Next, I performed a network analysis on the cross-mended ceramic vessels, using each layer as a node and each cross-mend between sherds as an edge. Finally, I examined the other 18th century wells fully excavated in Williamsburg, as well as mentions of wells and well repair from documentary records to determine how often wells were cleaned in the 18th century. This chart shows the dates of each layer as calculated by each of the 3 methods. While the three methods aren't in total agreement, in fact, many of the layers actually had a mean ceramic date which was earlier than its TPQ, they were mostly consistent in the relative dates of the layers. Each method found that the upper layers of organic sludge were deposited around the same time as the rest of the fill, whereas the lower layers of organic sludge dated several decades earlier. The network analysis of crossmends between layers found similar results. In this graphical representation of the network, each circle represents a layer, and the thickness of the lines or edges between circles represents the number of ceramic vessels with sherds from both layers. Strong connections between layers indicate that they contain trash from the same source, and therefore were likely deposited around the same time. After calculating the modularity of each node, 5 different groups, each one represented by a different color, were identified. The modularity analysis indicates that there was a weak separation between the upper and lower layers of the hearth ash layers, which suggests that the layers were deposited relatively slowly over time rather than all at once. Additionally, there was no strong connection between the upper layers of organic sludge and the lower layers of the same deposit, supporting the interpretation they were part of 2 separate depositional episodes. Both of these analyses of artifacts recovered from the well support the interpretation that the bottommost 2 layers of the well fill were deposited several decades earlier than the rest of the fill, when the well was still in use. However, modern guides to constructing and maintaining hand-dug wells recommend that they be cleaned about once a year to prevent them from being fouled. If this practice was followed in the past, it is unlikely that a large trash deposit in the bottom of the well could be left intact for several decades. I examined several sources to determine how often well cleaning actually took place in the 18th and 19th century Williamsburg. First, I examined other wells which have been excavated in Williamsburg to see if any of them had similarly early deposits at their base. I found 2 other wells which contained a well bucket, presumably the first thing to be thrown in a well when it was filled, which was not at the very bottom of the well. This suggests that both of these wells had some amount of soil deposition at their bases before they were filled. Next, I examined the account book of Humphrey Harwood, a general contractor who worked in Williamsburg in the late 18th century. While Harwood's accounts contain numerous entries charging people to repair and build their wells, in every case this involved some amount of brick and mortar to be used. There is only one entry involving only well cleaning, when a customer paid Harwood by renting him 2 enslaved men, named Sam and Tom, for 2 days to clean a well. The Harwood account indicates that while digging and repairing wells were jobs that required a professional, cleaning wells was much more likely to be a chore taken care of by members of the household. Newspaper articles and books, such as a narrative of the life and travels of John Robert Shaw, an autobiography written in 1807 by a well digger who excavated hundreds of wells in Pennsylvania and Kentucky in the late 18th and early 19th century, support this interpretation. It is only when something went very wrong, such as when an enslaved man in Alexandria, Virginia died in 1797 after being sent down a well to clean it by his owner, that documentary sources mention professional well diggers being hired to clean out wells. Therefore, if the owner of the Custis Square property chose not to clean the well for whatever reason, and did not want to spend the money to hire a professional to do so, then it's possible that a deposit of trash at the bottom of the well could survive for many years. One possible reason that an owner might not have cleaned the well is if they were renting the property out, as was the case with the Custis Square property in the mid-18th century, and therefore did not feel responsible for maintaining it. Following Custis IV's death in 1749, the majority of his estate, including the Custis Square property, was inherited by his son Daniel Parke Custis and daughter-in-law Martha Dandridge Custis. At the time, Daniel and Martha lived at the White House plantation in New Kent County, many miles up the river from Williamsburg, and it appears they only spent a little time, if any, at the Custis Square house. They hired an overseer to stop in and check up on the enslaved individuals living at Custis Square, quote, when his business allowed, unquote, and letters sent to them at this time were addressed to New Kent County. In 1757, when Daniel Parke Custis died, his estate was divided between his widow Martha and his infant son John Parke Custis. It was at this point, as part of the legal proceedings following Daniel's death, that the first surviving probate inventory of the Custis Square estate was taken. A close reading of this detailed inventory paints a picture of a once handsomely furnished manor which had been left mostly abandoned following Custis IV's death. The house was still fully furnished, including an unusually large amount of framed art still on the walls, but many of the items were described as old or out of fashion by the middle of the 18th century. The only individuals who may have been living at the estate were, quote, an old Negro woman Cornelia, end quote, and, quote, a Negro girl Beck, end quote, who were listed in the inventory. Cornelia and Beck were also listed on the inventory of a nearby Custis plantation, so it is possible that they did not live at Custis Square full-time either. Most of the furnishings in the Custis Square house in Williamsburg were sold at an estate sale which took place sometime in October 1759, a few years after the probate inventory was taken. The majority of the objects were bought by local Williamsburg merchants, presumably to be resold in their stores. After the sale, the Custis family lawyer, John Mercer, went through the inventory and marked which items were sold, which were inherited by John Parke Custis, and which were inherited by Martha and her new husband, George Washington. Following the estate sale, Washington, who was tasked with managing John Parke Custis's inheritance until he reached the age of majority, rented out the Custis Square property. A succession of renters occupied the house in the 1760s and 1770s, none of whom lived there for more than a few years. It was only in 1779 that Dr. James McClurg, a physician and professor at the College of William and Mary, purchased the property and moved himself and his family in. A few months after purchasing the property, McClurg hired Humphrey Harwood to make a number of alterations to the structure, including making repairs to a well. Based on this evidence, it appears that the well was still in use throughout the period when the property was occupied by renters. The McClurg family continued to own the house until they eventually sold it in 1811. By comparing the archaeology and documentary records, a more precise timeline of well-filling events becomes clear. The initial deposition of layers X and Y are likely occurred in 1759 when Martha and George Washington sold Custis IV's household furnishings and cleaned out the Custis Square estate in order to prepare it for renters. The sets of stemmed tableware and marked wine bottles found in these layers can actually be linked to entries on the probate inventory and were both marked as inherited by Martha by the lawyer. We know that some of the objects from the house at Custis Square did end up at Washington's home in Mount Vernon, but they apparently decided that they did not need all 120 wine bottles marked with Martha's old father-in-law's name that were inventoried in the cellar. The rest of the organic sludge layers, as well as the sterile fill layers, were deposited about 20 years later, probably by the McClurg family soon after they moved into the house. All of the garden clippings were found in these layers, suggesting that these artifacts are not related to the Custis occupation of the house, but to the later owners. The upper layers of fill were then deposited in the last few decades of the 18th century during the McClurg occupancy. Therefore, while some layers of organic sludge date considerably later than the rest, my analysis indicates that Hume's interpretation of the lowest layers of fill in Well B as household clearance of deposits associated with John Custis IV's occupation of the Custis Square property best fits the archaeological and historical data. In the introduction to the edited volume, Households Beyond the House, Mary Beaudry points out that household clearance deposits represent an unusual type of archaeological assemblage, which are the remnants of change and uncertainty. Unlike most midden deposits, which are the accumulated remains of mundane, day-to-day activities, household clearance deposits consist of a sudden disposal of objects during a disaster or major disjunction in the constitution of a household. Beaudry challenged archaeologists to consider the emotional dimensions of these assemblages, as both the objects themselves and the act of disposing of them are physical representations of sudden changes in domestic life. This assemblage, found at the base of Well B, is particularly well suited to this type of analysis. The image of throwing a wine glass down a well shaft is evocative on its own, but the wealth of archaeological and historical data that is available regarding this deposit provides additional context for the find. For instance, we can consider the emotional resonance of the action from the perspectives of Martha Washington and Beck. According to the inventory of the estate taken in 1757, the wine glass was kept in a closet in the hall of the manor with plates, utensils, and other dining-related furnishings. Anyone who has been legally required to go through a family member's belongings after their death and decide what to do with them can relate to the sense of exhaustion and frustration that Martha must have felt as she opened the closet and saw a parcel of glassware. In comparison, Beck, the young enslaved girl mentioned in the inventory, would have had a very different perspective on this same object and its disposal. Her experiences of the Custis property was most likely limited to the detached kitchen, and if she was allowed to touch the glassware, which would have only been almost totally unused within her lifetime, it would have only been for the sake of cleaning it. To her, the emptying of the Custis household was associated with a time of great upheaval in her family, as George Washington reorganized the enslaved workforce which he had inherited through his marriage. To Beck, the disposal of these glasses marked the end of a period of stability that turned out to be surprisingly fragile, just like the glass itself. Thank you very much.